Every day we make small decisions, often thinking little of their impacts. However, sometimes one person's actions can affect the entire world. It was a sunny day on the 22nd of November, 1963, when the 35th President of the United States of America made a decision which would have changed the course of history. Campaigning for his second term in Dallas, Texas, President John F. Kennedy went against the advice of his security staff, opting for an open-roof motorcade, providing little protection. Being the youngest president ever elected to office, it was no secret that his competitive edge to his opponents was his good looks. It was a common saying during the 1960 election that those who saw him on television were more likely to vote for him, whilst those who listened to his opponent, Richard Nixon, on radio agreed with him more. Hyper-aware of this, Kennedy saw his visibility to the people as crucial for his re-election. At approximately 12:30 p.m., Kennedy was shot dead. His decision to sacrifice safety for political gain had irreversibly changed American society. Tonight, I'm going to delve into the long-standing and widespread effects of this decision. Firstly, I want to discuss the short-term impacts of JFK's assassination, then, looking more broadly, how violence became such a defining feature of 1960s politics, ultimately increasing division. Finally, I want to talk about the most lasting impact, the increased distrust of the US government, a result of decades of compounding skepticism. To many, Kennedy embodied the essence of America. As the youngest president ever elected at 43, he gave optimism to voters, believing him to be a symbol of innovation and progression. Additionally, as the first ever Catholic president and descendant of Irish immigrants, Kennedy personified the American dream, the ideal that everyone, despite their background, has the ability to succeed simply through dedication and effort. With these factors at play, many viewed Kennedy's presidency as a golden age. His assassination, however, acted as a stark contrast to his presidency, marking a gruesome and dark end to short-lived optimism. Kennedy's assassination occurred in a time of changing global and domestic politics. Globally, the US was locked in the Cold War with the Soviet Union, with events such as the Cuban Missile Crisis and the Vietnam War defining Kennedy's presidential career. Domestically, issues surrounding the segregation of African Americans from white society saw the rise of the civil rights movement. Kennedy sought to undo this global and domestic division through peace talks with Soviet President Khrushchev and introducing legislation banning segregation. His sudden death ended peace talks with the Soviet Union, continuing the Cold War indefinitely. It also put his vice president, Lyndon B. Johnson, into power, whose political values were vastly different from his own. Whilst Kennedy was preparing to pull troops out of Vietnam, Johnson escalated military presence. The American political landscape and its trajectory had been changed instantly by a bullet. The idea that a lone attacker was able to shape politics through violence had devastating effects on civility in the US. Fed up with legal avenues, many turned to violence, viewing it as the only way to ensure change. What followed was a string of politically motivated killings aimed at drastically changing the political landscape. Notable activists and politicians were killed, such as civil rights activists Malcolm X in 1963 and Martin Luther King Jr. in 1965, as well as JFK's own brother, Robert F. Kennedy, in 1968, who was running for president at the time on an anti-segregation campaign. However, these violent attempts often failed to achieve their objective of slowing political progression. Martin Luther King Jr.'s death is often viewed as the catalyst for the signing of the Civil Rights Act, occurring only days after his death. This failure of even the most extreme actions brought more and more anguish to a tested population. Kennedy's death had created a violent chain reaction of events, dividing and fracturing the American public. This would be seen further as LBJ increased military support for Vietnam. Many believed this was necessary to preserve the concept of American exceptionalism and to contain communism. However, others simply saw it as endangering American youth to interfere in another nation's domestic politics. The anti-war movement, despite originally preaching peace, ironically soon descended into the same violence they condemned. When police were called in to quell protesters, confrontations and further violence ensued. Universities had become battlegrounds, and America was divided. The effects of this division can still be felt today, as the polarization that occurred in the 1960s still remains in the current political landscape. In fact, the only thing the US seems to be united on is their division. A recent Gallup poll showed that 80% of the population believing the country to be greatly divided, the highest number recorded yet. Despite being unable to determine the exact cause of this downward trajectory, the 1960s can be pinpointed as the time in which perceived unity began to decline, with pre-1960s levels not being reached since. In addition to disunity, many believe Kennedy's assassination to be the result of a government plot by Vice President Johnson to seize power, or, according to the inordinate amount of conspiracy theories, anyone from Cuba's Fidel Castro to the secretive Umbrella Man to the FBI were responsible, with the government cover-up preventing the truth from surfacing. In all cases, the American public linked Kennedy's death to the US government. As of 2023, 60 years after his assassination, a reported 50% of Americans still believe more than one person was involved. This fear of a government conspiracy or cover-up has led to wide government distrust, something the US has been unable to recover from. In countries that experience high levels of government trust, such as Switzerland, Luxembourg, and Finland, there are also high levels of self-reported happiness and well-being, suggesting a correlation between the two. The US, however, has high levels of perceived lack of freedoms and government corruption, impacting general happiness levels. It is unlikely the US will ever recover from the widespread distrust it faces, posing risks of retaliation and revolt from the public. After all, Americans were angered enough over tea prices to start a revolution. Whilst Kennedy's assassination was a single event caused by a small change to security protocol, it had a big impact, with widespread effects across the entire American political environment. The division caused by his assassination led to violence and distrust that is still ever present in today's society. So next time someone says, "Who cares, we're all just on a floating rock," tell them how JFK's car choice in 1963 ultimately led to the fracturing of the political landscape, categorized by widespread government distrust and violence, producing little positive change. However, it's not all gloom and doom. If small acts can have large negative impacts, they can have positive ones too. Gestures such as holding open a door or giving up your seat on a bus may seem small to you. However, to someone else, they may mean the world. Thank you very much.